The woman pointed her finger at me before she even reached her chair. I have watched defendants curse under their breath, landlords slam receipts on tables, and people with too much pride mistake my courtroom for a place where volume could defeat evidence. But Karen Whitmore did something I had not seen in years. She walked in, looked straight at the bench, raised her hand, and warned me like I was the one on trial. And before she could sit down, the bailiff was already moving toward her. 60 seconds later, that same woman was in handcuffs, crying that everyone had misunderstood her. But I had not misunderstood anything. Before we go any further, make sure you have subscribed to this channel for more powerful courtroom stories like this one. And if you haven't subscribed yet, do it now. Also, comment below and tell us where you are watching this video from. Now, let me take you back to where this case truly began. The file in front of me looked ordinary. That is how many disturbing cases begin. It was listed as a landlord-tenant dispute. A young woman named Natalie Brooks was suing her former landlord, Karen Whitmore, for illegal lockout, missing property, emotional distress, and the return of a security deposit. Karen claimed Natalie had abandoned the rental unit, violated the lease, brought dangerous people onto the property, and left the apartment in poor condition. On paper, it sounded like a typical housing conflict. Inside my courtroom, it became something else entirely. Natalie Brooks entered first. She was 27 years old, dressed in a plain gray sweater and black pants, holding a large envelope against her chest. She looked exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. Her eyes moved across the courtroom carefully, as if she was checking whether she was finally somewhere safe. I have seen that look many times. People who have been bullied do not enter a courtroom like performers. They enter like survivors. They scan faces. They keep their papers close. They speak softly at first because they have learned that every word can be turned against them. Then Karen Whitmore entered. Karen was in her early 50s, wearing a red blazer, black heels, and an expression of pure offense. Not fear, not worry, offense. She looked like the inconvenience of being sued had insulted her personally. Her sunglasses were pushed onto her head. Her folder was tucked under one arm, and her mouth was already tight before the case was even called. The bailiff announced the matter. Natalie stepped forward quietly. Karen stepped forward like she had been waiting for a stage. Before I asked a single question, Karen lifted her finger toward the bench and said, "You need to stop this before she starts lying." The room froze. There are many ways to lose control in a courtroom. Some people do it by shouting, some by interrupting, some by laughing at the wrong moment. Karen did it by assuming the court was another person she could intimidate. The bailiff said, "Mom, lower your hand." Karen did not lower it. Instead, she turned toward him and said, "Don't tell me what to do." That was the moment I leaned forward, not because my ego was offended. A judge's ego has no place in the courtroom, but order does. Without order, the vulnerable never get heard. Without order, the loudest person becomes the law. And I could already see that Karen had spent a long time relying on that exact principle. I said, Ms. Whitmore, lower your hand and take your place." She looked back at me with a cold little smile. Then she said, "You better be careful how you speak to me." The courtroom went silent in a way I still remember. Even Natalie stopped breathing for a moment. That sentence was not just rude. It was threatening. It was delivered toward the bench in open court before testimony had even begun. And when someone enters a courtroom threatening the authority of the court, a judge has to act before the whole proceeding becomes unsafe. The bailiff moved toward Karen. Her confidence cracked immediately. "What are you doing?" she snapped. The bailiff told her to turn around. Karen pulled her arm back. I said, "Don't touch me." Natalie flinched. That small movement told me more than Karen's entire opening performance. Natalie did not react like someone watching a stranger behave badly. She reacted like someone who had seen Karen switch from calm to dangerous before. I watched Karen closely as the bailiff took control of the situation. Her face changed from arrogance to outrage, then from outrage to panic. That transformation always interests me. People who use fear against others often cannot tolerate even a small taste of authority applied to themselves. She said, "This is illegal. I know my rights." I answered, "You have rights, Ms. Whitmore. You do not have permission to threaten the court. I didn't threaten you. You pointed at the bench and told the court to be careful. I meant with your attitude." That was her first real reveal. Manipulative people often believe they can edit the meaning of their words after the room reacts. They throw the threat, then call it tone. They create fear, then call it misunderstanding. They light the match, then act surprised when everyone smells smoke. The bailiff placed her in a side chair near the defense table. I did not remove her from the courtroom immediately. I allowed her to remain because the case still needs to be heard, but I made one thing clear. I said, "If you interrupt again, if you gesture toward this bench again, or if you attempt to intimidate anyone in this courtroom, you will be held in contempt." Karen sat down slowly, but she did not look sorry. She looked furious that consequences had arrived faster than she expected. I turned to Natalie. "Ems Brooks, tell me why you are here." Natalie swallowed. For a moment she could not speak. Her fingers tightened around the envelope, and I watched her force herself to look at me instead of Karen. Then she said, "She locked me out of my apartment and kept my father's ashes." The courtroom shifted. Not loudly, not dramatically, but every person felt it. A missing deposit is one kind of case, a lockout is another, but a landlord keeping a tenant's father's ashes turns the room colder. I asked Natalie to explain. She told me she rented a small apartment above Karen's detached garage. She had lived there for 8 months, paid rent on time, and had no written violations. At first, Karen seemed strict but polite. She cared about parking, noise, packages, and cleanliness. Natalie said she could live with strict rules. But then Natalie began dating a man named Ryan Carter. Ryan was a paramedic. He did not live with her. He did not have a key. He visited occasionally, helped carry groceries, and once stayed late after Natalie had a panic attack related to her father's death. Karen did not like him. At first, she made comments. Then she made rules. No male visitors after 8. No parking in the driveway for more than 30 minutes. No guests entering through the side gate. No suspicious individuals on the property. I asked Natalie if those rules were in the lease. She shook her head. "No, Your Honor." Karen laughed under her breath. I looked at her. She stopped. That is another thing I noticed early. Karen understood consequences when they were immediate. She simply believed she could avoid them long enough to hurt people outside the courtroom. Natalie pulled out printed text messages. One message from Karen said, "If that man comes around again, you will regret bringing him here." Another said, "This is my property. I decide who belongs on it." Another said, "You should remember who gave you a place to live." That last sentence stayed with me. People like Karen often confuse a rental agreement with ownership over another person's life. She did not see Natalie as a tenant with rights. She saw her as someone who should remain grateful, obedient, and alone. I asked Karen if she changed the locks. Karen folded her arms. She abandoned the unit. Natalie shook her head, tears already forming. "I was at my sister's for 2 nights because I was scared." I asked, "Did you notify Karen you would be away?" "Yes." I texted her. She handed over another screenshot. Natalie had written, "I'm staying with my sister this weekend. I'll be back Monday after work." Karen replied, "That may be best." Then on Monday, Natalie came home to find the locks changed. A notice was taped to the door. It read, "Unit abandoned. Property secured." I looked at the notice, then at Karen. You considered 2 nights away after receiving written notice to be abandonment. Karen said she was avoiding communication. You replied to her message. She was creating an unsafe environment. With what? Karen looked toward the courtroom door. That glance mattered. She was not looking for an answer. She was looking for someone. I asked, Miss Whitmore, who are you looking for? She said nothing. Then the courtroom door opened. A tall man in a dark blue paramedic uniform stepped inside, holding a phone in one hand and a small cardboard box in the other. Natalie turned, saw him, and immediately started crying. Karen's face changed. The anger drained just enough for fear to show underneath. The man said, Your Honor, my name is Ryan Carter. I was there the night Natalie found out what Karen did. Karen stood so quickly her chair scraped the floor. He is not allowed to speak. The bailiff stepped toward her again. This time, Karen sat down before he reached her. Ryan looked at Natalie, then at me. I recorded everything, he said. And that was when Karen Whitmore, the woman who had pointed at me like she owned the courtroom, suddenly looked as if the walls had started closing in, because whatever was on that phone, she already knew it could destroy her story. Ryan Carter did not walk toward the front of the courtroom like a man eager to embarrass someone. That was the first thing I noticed. He moved carefully, with the steady discipline of a paramedic who had learned how to stay calm inside other people's worst moments. His uniform was slightly wrinkled, as if he had come straight from a long shift. His eyes were tired, but focused. And when he looked at Natalie, he did not speak over her, touch her, or rush to become the center of the story. He simply stood close enough for her to know she was not alone. That mattered to me. People reveal themselves not only through what they do, but through what they do not do. Ryan did not perform protection. Karen Whitmore performed outrage. I asked Ryan to step forward and explain why he was present. Before he could answer, Karen said, He's the reason all of this happened. The bailiff turned toward her. Karen immediately stopped speaking, but the damage was already done. That one sentence told me she had not come to court to answer a claim. She had come to continue a campaign. I looked at Ryan. Mr. Carter, go ahead. He placed his phone on the evidence table, but kept the cardboard box in his hand. I was with Natalie the night she came home and found the locks changed. He said, She called me because she couldn't get inside. I drove over from work. I asked if he lived there. No, Your Honor. Did you have a key? No. Were you listed on the lease? No. Did you ever claim a right to live there? No. I visited her. That's all. His answers were simple, direct, no decoration. That does not automatically make a witness truthful, but it does make a judge listen differently. Liars often overbuild. They explain corners no one asked about. Ryan was answering only what I asked, and that restraint carried weight. I asked Natalie how long she had known him. She said 4 months. They met at a community health fair where Ryan's ambulance crew had volunteered. Natalie had been helping at a registration table. After her father died, she had started volunteering because, in her words, being around people made the apartment feel less empty. Karen rolled her eyes. I saw it, so did Natalie. And for 1 second, Natalie's face changed from sadness to shame, as if grief itself had been caught doing something wrong. That angered me more than I showed. A courtroom is not a place where grief should have to defend its manners. I said, Mrs. Whitmore, if you react to her pain again, you will leave this room. Karen looked down. Her body obeyed, but her face still resisted. Ryan continued. He said Karen disliked him from the beginning. At first, she asked questions that sounded normal, but felt strange. Where did he live? Why did he work nights? Why did he drive a city vehicle sometimes? Why was he always hanging around? Then the questions turned into accusations. One evening, Karen came outside while Ryan was carrying groceries up the stairs to Natalie's apartment. She stood at the bottom step and said, "Men like you always start helpful." The courtroom went quiet. I asked Ryan what he understood that to mean. He paused. That pause was not weakness, it was discipline. He was choosing not to turn the courtroom into an argument about insult. He was staying with the facts. He said, "I understood that she had already decided I was dangerous." Karen muttered, "I have instincts." I turned toward her. "Instincts do not rewrite leases." She said nothing. Nathalie then explained the pattern. After Ryan corrected Karen about guest parking one evening, Karen's behavior escalated. She began sending messages every time Ryan visited. She photographed his car. She stood at the upstairs window watching the staircase. She told Nathalie that a young woman living alone should be careful who she lets influence her. That phrase stayed with me. Influence her, not visit her, not harm her. Influence her. Karen's real fear was not Ryan's danger. It was Nathalie's independence. I asked Nathalie whether Karen had entered her apartment without permission. Nathalie nodded. The first time I could prove it was when I found a note on my kitchen counter. Inside the apartment? Yes. What did it say? Nathalie took a page from her envelope and handed it to the bailiff. The note was printed in block letters. Guest privileges are under review. No signature, no legal notice, no emergency explanation, just control placed on a kitchen counter inside a tenant's private home. I looked at Karen. "Did you leave this note?" Karen folded her arms. "I manage my property." That is not an answer. It is my property. Did you enter the apartment? I had concerns. Did you provide written notice? I don't need permission to protect my property. There it was, that dangerous misunderstanding again. Property ownership does not make a tenant disappear as a human being. When a landlord rents a space, the tenant receives legal rights to privacy, possession, and basic dignity. Karen did not understand that because she did not want to understand it. She saw the apartment as hers even when someone else was paying to live there. I asked whether there was an emergency. Karen hesitated. I thought there might be. What emergency? A leak. Where? In the bathroom. Was there a leak? I didn't find one. Did you tell Nathalie you entered? She noticed. That answer was colder than it sounded. She noticed. As if Nathalie discovering a violation was the same thing as notice. Nathalie said, after that, she started taking photographs before leaving for work. She photographed drawers, windows, the position of her laptop, the shelf where her father's urn rested. She said she felt ridiculous doing it at first. She thought maybe she was overreacting. I have heard that phrase from too many people who were not overreacting. Manipulation makes a person doubt the evidence of their own life. A moved drawer becomes maybe I forgot. A missing paper becomes maybe I misplaced it. A strange note becomes maybe I caused this. The mind tries to protect itself by making the danger smaller, but danger does not become smaller because you name it gently. Ryan said he encouraged Nathalie to document everything, not to start a fight. To protect herself, Karen pointed toward him again, not at me this time, but at Ryan. He was filling her head with paranoia. The bailiff moved. Karen dropped her hand immediately. I looked at her. The pointing stops now. She pressed her lips together. I asked Ryan about the night of the lockout. He unlocked his phone and explained that Nathalie called him crying at 6:22 p.m. She had come home from work and found her key did not fit. Her lights were off. A notice was taped to the door. Several boxes that had been inside the apartment were visible through the garage window. He drove there and began recording because Karen was already shouting when he arrived. I allowed the recording to be played. The courtroom listened to wind noise first, then Nathalie's voice shaking. "Karen, my key doesn't work." "Why did you change the lock?" Karen's recorded voice answered, sharp and clear. "Because you don't get to turn my home into a shelter for trouble." Nathalie said, "This is my apartment. I paid rent. Karen replied, you paid for space, not disrespect. I watched Natalie as the recording played. She seemed to shrink with every word. That is the problem with hearing abuse repeated in public. Part of you is relieved the room finally hears it. Another part is forced to live it again. The recording continued. Ryan's voice could be heard, calm. Mom, she needs her medication and work laptop. Can you please open the door so she can get essentials? Karen said, you don't speak to me. Ryan said, I'm not trying to argue. Karen answered, no, you're trying to intimidate me on my own property. That line was strategic. People like Karen often accuse others of the very tactic they are using. If she could label Ryan intimidating, then her cruelty became self-defense. If she could label Natalie unstable, then Natalie's panic became proof. If she could label the lockout as abandonment, then Karen's illegal action became property management. The recording reached the part that changed the courtroom. Natalie said, please, just give me my father's urn. Keep everything else tonight if you want, but please give me my dad. There was a long pause. Then Karen's voice came through. You should have thought about that before choosing him over my rules. No one moved. I looked at Karen. Her face had tightened into something hard and defensive. Not sorry. Defensive. I asked her, did you hear what you said? She said, that was taken out of context. Then provide the context. She was hysterical. She was asking for her father's ashes. She was using that to manipulate the situation. A few people in the gallery reacted under their breath. I silenced the room, but I understood the reaction. There are certain moments when cruelty becomes so plain that even strangers feel personally offended by it. I asked Natalie where her father's urn had been kept. On the shelf beside my bed. Did Karen know what it was? Yes. She asked about it once. I told her, when? 2 months before the lockout. What did she say? Natalie looked down. She said keeping ashes was unhealthy. Karen said, it is. I turned toward her. Your opinion about grief is not law. Karen looked away. Ryan then told me why he brought the cardboard box. He said he found it that morning outside the courthouse, near Karen's vehicle. He had parked behind her by coincidence and saw her son, Evan Whitmore, moving boxes from the trunk into the back seat. One box fell open. Ryan saw Natalie's photo album inside. Karen's face changed. That was important. I asked Ryan if he confronted Evan. He said no. He took a photograph from a distance and told Natalie quietly before the hearing began. Natalie had not wanted to mention it until she knew whether the box actually contained her property. I asked to see the photograph. Ryan showed the screen. There it was. A cardboard box on the pavement near the courthouse parking area, its top bent open. Inside, I could see the corner of a photo album and what looked like a small framed picture. Natalie's hand went to her mouth. Karen said, that proves nothing. I asked, where is your son? Karen went still. Why? Because his name has now entered this case. He has nothing to do with this. That is not your decision. The courtroom door opened again before I had to instruct the bailiff. A young man in a black hoodie stood just inside the entrance. He had the drawn, anxious face of someone who had been listening from the hallway and losing a private battle with his conscience. He looked at Karen, then at Natalie, then at me. Karen whispered, Evan, leave. But Evan Whitmore did not leave. He walked forward slowly, holding another small box in both hands. His voice shook when he spoke. Your Honor, I'm sorry. There's more in the car. Karen's eyes filled with panic. And that was when I knew the case had just moved beyond an illegal lockout, because whatever Evan had brought to court, his own mother looked terrified for me to see it. The box in Evan Whitmore's hands looked ordinary brown cardboard, clear packing tape, one corner crushed from being moved too many times. But I watched Karen's face as her son carried it toward the evidence table. And I knew before the lid was opened that this box held something she had been desperate to keep hidden. Karen did not look angry anymore. She looked exposed. That is a different kind of fear. Anger moves outward. Exposure turns inward. It makes a person search for exits that do not exist. Even placed the box on the table and kept both hands resting on top of it, as if he were afraid his mother might try to grab it back. He was young, 23, wearing a black hoodie and jeans, with the nervous posture of someone who had been raised around control and was only now learning what courage felt like. I asked him, "Are these Natalie Brooks' belongings?" He looked at Natalie, then at me. "Yes, Your Honor." Natalie closed her eyes. Ryan stood beside her, still controlled, but I could see his jaw tighten. He had been accused of being dangerous, unstable, a threat to the property, yet every minute in that courtroom showed me the opposite. He was restraining himself in a situation where many people would have lost control. Karen said, "He doesn't know what he's talking about." The bailiff took one step. Karen stopped immediately. I looked at Evan. "Tell the court what happened." He swallowed. "My mom told me Natalie abandoned the apartment. She said Natalie left because Ryan convinced her to run off and that we had to clear the unit before he came back." Natalie's eyes opened. "That's not true," she whispered, even nodded quickly. "I know that now. I didn't then." That mattered, not because ignorance excuses everything, but because his shame looked real. His voice was not defensive. It was heavy. He was not trying to protect himself as much as he was trying to stop protecting a lie. I asked Evan when he helped remove the items. The same night, Natalie came home and found the locks changed. That answer struck the room. I looked at Karen. She was staring down at her folder now, but her fingers had begun tapping the edge of the table. That little tapping told me her mind was racing. She knew the timeline was closing around her. I asked, "Before Natalie returned or after?" Evan hesitated. Karen looked up sharply. I said, "Mr. Whitmore, look at me." He did. "Before or after?" His voice dropped. "Before." The courtroom shifted. That single word changed the entire case. Before. Karen had not changed the locks because Natalie abandoned the apartment. Karen had decided Natalie was gone before Natalie even came home. She had removed belongings before any confrontation at the door. She had created the abandonment story first, then waited for Natalie to walk into it. I asked Evan what time they began clearing the apartment. Around 4:30. Natalie said, "I got off work at 5. Ryan looked at Karen. Karen did not look back. I asked Evan how they entered the unit. "My mom had a spare key." "Did Natalie give permission?" "No." "Was there an emergency?" "No." "Did you see any damage inside the apartment?" He looked confused. "No. It looked normal." Karen finally spoke, her voice tight. "He is not qualified to inspect property damage." "I'm Ms. Whitmore." "Your son is qualified to know whether a room looked normal when he carried boxes out of it." She went silent, even opened the box. The first item he removed was a photo album. Natalie's hand went to her mouth. It was blue, worn at the corners, with a silver sticker on the front that read, "Dad and Me." Evan placed it gently on the table. Then he removed a framed picture of Natalie as a little girl sitting on a porch beside a man with kind eyes and broad shoulders. Natalie began crying, not loudly, just enough that her breath broke. Evan looked ashamed. "I'm sorry," he said. Karen whispered, "Don't apologize." That sentence was so quiet that some people may not have heard it. I did. And so did Natalie. I looked at Karen and said, "You just told your son not to apologize for taking this woman's belongings." Karen's face flushed. "I meant he shouldn't admit fault for something he was tricked into." "By whom?" No answer. That silence sat heavily between us. Even continued removing items. A laptop charger, a work badge, a stack of unopened mail, 2 small prescription bottles, a folded scarf, a damaged jewelry case. Then he reached the bottom of the box and froze. I noticed immediately. The hand tells the truth before the mouth does. His fingers touched something wrapped in a towel, and suddenly he could not lift it. Natalie whispered, "What is it?" Evan looked at his mother. Karen's face had gone pale. I asked, "Mr. Whitmore, remove the item." He did, slowly. Inside the towel was a small brass urn. Natalie almost collapsed. Ryan reached toward her, but again he waited until she grabbed his arm. That restraint mattered. It proved more about his character than Karen's accusations ever could. The urn was small, no taller than a drinking glass, with a dark blue band around the center. On the front there was an engraved name, Thomas Brooks, Natalie's father. I have handled enough emotionally charged evidence to know when a courtroom is about to lose its composure. The gallery began whispering. Someone gasped. Even the bailiff's expression hardened. I ordered silence. But inside, I understood why the room reacted. There are objects that belong to the law, receipts, texts, lease agreements, notices. And then there are objects that belong to the soul. That urn was not property in the ordinary sense. It was grief made physical. It was the last place Natalie could still reach for her father. I asked Evan whether he knew what it was when he packed it. He shook his head. "No, Your Honor, not at first." "At first?" He looked down. I asked my mom. I said, "What is this?" She said, "Something Natalie uses for attention." Natalie made a small sound, like the air had been knocked out of her. Karen said, "That is not what I said." Evan looked at her with pain in his face. "Yes, it is." There are moments when a child testifying against a parent changes the whole room. Not because the law treats family testimony as automatically true, but because betrayal inside a family has its own terrible gravity. Evan was not enjoying this. He was breaking something in himself to tell the truth. I asked what happened after he realized it was an urn. Evan said he told Karen they should return it immediately. Karen refused. She said Natalie needed to learn that actions have consequences. Evan said he placed the urn in the garage with the other items. Then he looked at Natalie. "I didn't open it, I swear." Natalie's tears stopped for a second. That sentence meant something. I asked, "Why would you say that?" Evan swallowed. "Because when I checked the box this morning, the lid was loose." Ryan looked at Karen. Natalie's face drained of color. I looked at the urn. From the bench, I could not inspect it closely yet, but I could see the lid did not sit perfectly flush. I asked Evan, who had access to the box after it was packed. "My mom. Anyone else?" "No," Karen said. "This is disgusting. Now they're accusing me of opening human remains." I looked at her for a long moment. "Mrs. Whitmore, the accusation is not coming from them. The question is coming from the condition of the evidence." She looked away. That was when Natalie pulled something from her envelope with trembling hands. A photograph. The bailiff brought it to me. It showed the urn sitting on Natalie's bedside shelf before the lockout. The lid was sealed with a thin blue strip intact. The date stamp on the photo was 2 days before Natalie stayed at her sister's house. I compared it to the urn on the table. The blue seal was broken. The courtroom felt colder. I asked Karen, "Did you open this urn?" "No." Her answer was fast. Too fast. "Did you break the seal?" "No." "Did you instruct Evan to break the seal?" "No." "Did anyone else enter the garage?" "No." "Then how did the seal break?" She folded her arms. "How would I know? Maybe Natalie did it before." Natalie shook her head, crying again. I held up the photo. This photograph suggests otherwise. Karen's eyes narrowed. Photos can be staged. That was the moment I saw what she would do if allowed to continue unchecked. She would attack the picture. She would attack Ryan. She would attack Natalie's grief. She would attack her own son if necessary. Anything to keep the lie moving. I asked Evan if there were more items in the car. He nodded. 2 boxes. "What is in them?" "Clothes, more pictures, and some documents. But there's something else." Karen's chair scraped slightly. I looked at him. "What else?" He hesitated, then said, "A trash bag." Natalie looked confused. Karen closed her eyes. I asked, "What is inside the trash bag?" Evan's voice dropped. "I think it's pieces of things Mom said were too damaged to return." That sentence opened a new wound in the case. I ordered the bailiff to secure the remaining boxes from the vehicle. Karen sat frozen, but I could see her breathing had changed. Short, shallow, angry. The hearing paused for several minutes while the items were brought in. Nobody spoke. Natalie stood with one hand on the table, Ryan beside her, Evan several feet away from his mother, and Karen sitting alone with her folder still closed in front of her. That folder had become useless now. Paper lies cannot compete with the objects they tried to erase. When the bailiff returned, he carried 2 boxes and 1 black trash bag. The bag was placed on the evidence table. I asked Natalie if she was prepared to look. She nodded, though her face said she was not. The bag was opened. Inside were broken picture frames, torn pages from a photo album, cracked glass, a shattered ceramic angel, and a small wooden plaque that had been split in 2. Natalie covered her mouth. "My dad made that," Karen muttered. "It was already broken." Evan turned toward her. No, it wasn't. The room went still again. I asked Evan how he knew. He looked directly at me. "Because I saw her break it after Natalie called the police." Karen stood up. "Enough." The bailiff moved toward her, but Karen did not sit this time. Her face was red. Her hands were shaking. The same woman who had pointed at me at the beginning of the hearing now pointed at her own son. "You ungrateful little liar," she said, and before she could say another word, before she could take one more step toward Evan, the bailiff reached her side. That was when the case stopped being only about Natalie's apartment. Because Karen had just shown the entire courtroom what happened to anyone who told the truth against her, the bailiff reached Karen before her anger could cross the space between mother and son. That was important. Courtrooms do not wait for harm to become physical before they respond to danger. I had already watched Karen threaten the bench, intimidate Natalie, accuse Ryan, and now turn on Evan the moment he stopped protecting her. The pattern was no longer hidden. It was standing in front of everyone. Karen jerked her arm away when the bailiff took hold of her. "Don't touch me," she shouted. "He's lying. They're all lying." The bailiff kept his voice low. "Mom, turn around." I said, "Don't touch me." Her words echoed through the room, but this time the courtroom did not feel shocked. It felt confirmed. Everyone had seen the mask drop. Everyone had seen how quickly Karen's control became rage when someone refused to obey. Natalie was crying quietly at her table. Ryan stood beside her, one hand near her shoulder, but still waiting, still careful, still refusing to become the dangerous man Karen had tried to describe. Even looked shattered. That young man had just done one of the hardest things a person can do. He had told the truth about his own mother in a room full of strangers, and she rewarded him by calling him an ungrateful liar. I looked at Karen and said, "Mrs. Whitmore, sit down." She glared at me. For one terrible second, I thought she might point at the bench again, but the bailiff's hand was already firm on her arm. She sat. Not because she respected the order, because she understood she had no room left to perform. I let the silence stay for a moment. Judges do that sometimes. Silence allows people to feel the weight of what just happened. It also gives the room a chance to return to itself. Then I turned back to Evan. "Mr. Whitmore, you said you saw your mother break the wooden plaque." He nodded, but his eyes were wet now. "Yes, Your Honor. Tell me exactly what you saw." Karen whispered, "Evan, please." I did not even look at her. The bailiff did. She stopped. Evan took a breath. He said that after Natalie called police the night of the lockout, Karen came back into the garage furious. She was holding a small wooden plaque from one of Natalie's boxes. It had a handwritten message on the front. Evan remembered it because it looked homemade, not expensive. Natalie's voice broke. My dad made it when I got my first apartment. I asked what the plaque said. Natalie wiped her face with the back of her hand. It said, "A place of your own, but never alone." The courtroom softened around those words. You could feel it. Even people who had no connection to Natalie understood the cruelty of that object being broken. A father had made that for his daughter, maybe proudly, maybe awkwardly, maybe with his own hands in a garage or at a kitchen table. And Karen, who had already taken the urn, had found another piece of grief to punish, even said, Karen read the plaque out loud, laughed once, and said, then she should have stayed alone. Natalie closed her eyes. Brian's jaw tightened. The bailiff's expression hardened again. I looked at Karen. She was staring down at the table, but I could see the side of her face twitch. Not grief, not shame, anger. Anger at being exposed. I asked Evan, then what happened? She snapped it across the edge of the workbench. Did you try to stop her? I told her it was wrong. What did she say? Evan swallowed. She said if I felt sorry for Natalie, I could move out too. That was the second relationship Karen had turned into a hostage situation. Natalie's housing, Evan's home, Ryan's reputation, everything became leverage. People like Karen do not argue to resolve conflict. They argue to establish control. And when control fails, they punish everyone within reach. I asked the bailiff to bring the broken plaque closer. The two pieces were placed on the evidence table. The break ran through the word alone. I remember that clearly. The wood had split right through the word that had once been meant to comfort Natalie. That kind of detail stays with a judge, not because it changes the legal standard, because it tells you what the harm felt like. Natalie asked if she could hold it. I allowed it. She took the two pieces carefully, as if they were fragile bones. For a moment she did not cry. She just touched the broken letters with her thumb. Then she whispered, he made this the week before I moved in. No one interrupted her, not even Karen. I asked Natalie whether she wanted to continue. She nodded. That nod had a different strength in it now. She was not less hurt. But she was no longer alone inside the hurt. I turned to the trash bag. There were more damaged items inside. Torn photos, broken frame glass, a ceramic angel with one wing missing, a small journal bent in half, several envelopes opened and scattered. I asked Natalie if the envelopes were hers. She looked at them and nodded. They were letters from my dad. Karen said suddenly, they were in a trash bag. I looked at her. Because you put them there. No. Because she clearly didn't care about them. Natalie stared at her. That sentence was almost unbelievable in its cruelty. Karen had taken the letters, placed them in a bag with broken belongings, then argued the bag proved Natalie did not care. That is how manipulation works. The abuser creates the condition, then uses the condition as evidence against the victim. I asked Evan, who put the letters in the bag? He looked down. My mom. Karen slammed her hand on the table. The bailiff moved instantly. This time I did not warn her gently. I said, Mrs. Whitmore, you are in contempt. She froze. The courtroom froze with her. I continued. You threatened the court at the beginning of this proceeding. You interrupted testimony repeatedly. You attempted to intimidate a witness. You have now struck the table during testimony after being warned. You will be detained until this hearing concludes. Karen's mouth opened. For the first time, no words came out. Then she started crying. It began as anger. Her face red, her breathing sharp, her eyes wet with humiliation. But as the bailiff moved behind her and instructed her to stand, the anger turned into panic. No, she said. Wait. I didn't mean it. That sentence had followed her from the beginning. I didn't mean it. She did not mean the threat. She did not mean the lockout. She did not mean the urn. She did not mean the broken plaque. She did not mean the accusation. She never meant anything once consequences arrived. But meaning does not disappear because regret is late. The bailiff placed her hands behind her back. Natalie looked away. Ryan kept his eyes on the table, even began crying openly now. I watched Karen's face as she realized the courtroom she tried to dominate had finally taken control away from her. That moment was not satisfying. I do not take pleasure in seeing people restrained. A judge who enjoys humiliation should not be on the bench. But order had to be restored, and more importantly, the witnesses had to be protected. Karen was seated under the bailiff's supervision, restrained but still present so the matter could continue. She was no longer allowed to interrupt. No more pointing. No more threats. No more sudden outbursts breaking the testimony whenever the truth got too close. For the first time since the hearing began, Natalie spoke without looking over her shoulder. That mattered. I asked her to describe what the lockout had cost her. She said she missed 2 days of work because her badge and laptop were locked inside. Her supervisor issued a warning. She had to borrow clothes from her sister. She paid for temporary medication because her prescriptions were inaccessible. She slept on a couch for 9 nights. And every night, she said, she kept thinking about her father's ashes sitting in Karen's garage. Her voice broke. I kept thinking he was cold. Now, legally, I understood an urn does not feel temperature. A judge knows that. The law knows that. But grief does not speak in legal language. Grief says he was cold. Grief says I left him there. Grief says I failed him, even when the failure belongs entirely to someone else. I told Natalie, Mrs. Brooks, you did not leave him. He was taken from you. She covered her face. That was the first time she truly sobbed. Ryan put a hand on her shoulder only after she leaned into him. Again, permission. Agon, restraint. Agon, the opposite of the man Karen had described. I asked Evan if there was any more evidence. He hesitated. Karen looked up through her tears. Even restrained, she still had enough pride left to look dangerous. Evan said, "There's a video from the garage." Karen shook her head slowly, not in denial. In warning, I asked Evan what video. He said there was a security camera inside the garage aimed at the storage area. Karen had installed it because she believed delivery drivers were stealing packages. Evan said it captured part of the night they moved Natalie's belongings. I asked whether he had access. He said yes. The camera app was also on his phone because Karen sometimes asked him to check alerts when she was out. Do you have the footage? He swallowed. Yes, Your Honor. Karen began crying harder. That told me we were getting close to something even worse. The footage was prepared. The evidence screen flickered on. At first, the image was dark, a wide view of the garage with stacked boxes along the wall. Then Karen appeared, carrying Natalie's blue photo album. Evan followed with a larger box. Karen placed the album on the workbench and opened it. She flipped through the pages, slowly. Not like someone sorting property, like someone studying a life. Then she tore one photo from the album. Natalie whispered, "No." The footage continued. Karen held the photo up. It showed Natalie and her father outside a diner, smiling into the camera. Karen said something, but there was no audio yet. Evan adjusted his phone and said, "There is sound on the next clip." Karen lowered her head. I looked at Natalie. She nodded, barely. The next clip played with audio. Karen's voice came through from the garage camera, clear enough to make every person in the room go still. She thinks grief makes her untouchable. Evan's voice said, "Mom, just give the stuff back." Karen answered, "Not until she learns I decide what happens on my property." Then she tore the photograph in half. Natalie cried out. And in that moment, even I had to pause, because this was no longer just proof of unlawful control. It was proof of punishment carried out with precision. Karen was not angry at property damage. She was angry that Natalie had a life, love, grief, support, and a voice outside Karen's control. The video continued. Karen picked up the urn. She held it in both hands. Evan said, "Don't mess with that." Karen looked toward him. Then she said the sentence that made the entire courtroom fall into a silence I can still hear years later. She wants her father so badly. Let's see what she does when she has to beg. The room did not breathe after that. I have heard cruelty in courtrooms before. I have heard people say things they could never take back. I have watched family members destroy one another over money, landlords humiliate tenants over rent, and defendants smile while victims struggled to speak. But what Karen Whitmore said in that garage was different. Because it was not a moment of anger, it was a plan. Natalie stood frozen at the plaintiff's table, her face drained of color. Ryan held her carefully, but even he looked shaken now. Evan stared at the screen like he wished he could disappear inside the floor. And Karen, restrained beside the bailiff, was crying harder, not because the room misunderstood her, but because the room finally understood her too well. The footage continued. On the screen, Karen held the urn in both hands. She did not look confused. She did not look panicked. She looked thoughtful, almost calm, as if she were deciding how much pain would be enough. Evan's recorded voice said, "Mom, put it down." Karen turned toward him. "She brought this into my house," she said. Evan answered, "It's her dad." Karen said, "It's manipulation." That word told me everything, manipulation. That was how Karen saw Natalie's grief. Not as pain, not as memory, not as love, as a tool being used against her. And once a person convinces themselves that someone else's suffering is a weapon, they give themselves permission to strike first. On the footage, Evan stepped closer. Karen moved the urn away from him. "Don't," Evan said. Then Karen placed the urn on the workbench and twisted the lid. Natalie made a sound that forced me to pause the video. The bailiff looked at me. Ryan whispered something to Natalie, but she shook her head. Her eyes stayed locked on the screen, terrified and desperate, as if looking away would abandon her father a second time. I asked her, Miss Brooks, do you want the court to stop playback?" She was crying so hard she could barely speak, but she said no. That answer stayed with me, because courage does not always sound strong. Sometimes courage sounds broken and keeps going anyway. I allowed the video to continue. Karen opened the urn, not by accident, not because the lid was loose. She opened it. Evan shouted, "Mom!" Karen flinched, but did not stop. She looked inside the urn, then looked toward the boxes stacked against the garage wall. There was no dramatic music in that courtroom, no editing, no narration except the truth unfolding on a cold evidence screen. Karen reached for a small plastic storage bag. Natalie whispered, "No, no, no." I could see where this was going before it happened, and even I had to steady myself. A judge cannot allow emotion to control the bench, but only a fool would pretend some evidence does not enter the body like a wound. Karen tilted the urn slightly. A small amount of ash spilled onto the workbench and into the bag. The courtroom erupted. Natalie cried out and turned away, collapsing into Ryan's arms. Evan covered his face. Several people in the gallery gasped openly. Someone whispered, "Oh my God!" before they could stop themselves. I struck the bench once. Order. The room quieted, but the silence afterward was not calm. It was horrified. Karen was shaking now. "I didn't dump it," she said through tears. "It was just a little. I wasn't going to throw it away." I looked at her. That was the first time she admitted the video was real. She did not deny opening the urn. She did not deny touching the ashes. She defended the amount. And that told me her moral compass had broken long before she entered my courtroom. I said, "Mrs. Whitmore, you will not speak." She sobbed, but she obeyed. The video continued. Evan was crying on the recording now. "Why would you do that?" Karen sealed the plastic bag and placed it beside the torn photograph. "Because she needs to understand consequences," she said, even said, "This is insane." Karen turned toward him with a look I will never forget. If you feel sorry for her, you can leave with her. There it was again, control through exile. Loathe me or lose your home. Obey me or become the enemy. Karen did not have relationships. She had territories, and anyone who crossed the border became a threat. Then the footage shifted to the next clip. Evan explained from the witness area that the garage camera recorded short motion triggered segments. The next clip was from later that night, after Natalie and Ryan had left the property with police, still unable to force immediate access. Karen was alone in the garage. She stood in front of the boxes, holding Natalie's work badge in one hand and a stack of letters in the other. She opened one of the letters and began reading. Natalie's face changed. "My dad wrote those to me." Karen read silently for a moment. Then she laughed, not loudly, just enough. She folded the letter and placed it into the trash bag. Then she picked up the wooden plaque, the one Natalie's father made for her first apartment, and snapped it against the edge of the workbench. The crack echoed through the recording. Natalie covered her ears. Ryan held her tighter. Even looked at the floor, ashamed to witness again what he had already lived through. I asked Evan, "Did you know she did this part?" He shook his head. "No, Your Honor. I only saw the plaque after it was broken." That meant even Evan had not known the full extent of it. The video continued. Karen paced the garage, speaking aloud to herself. That happens more often than people realize. People alone with their anger rehearse the story they want the world to believe. They test words. They sharpen phrases. They convince themselves. Karen said, she abandoned it. She left. She chose him. She brought this on herself. Then she looked at the boxes. She'll come crawling back. The gallery was silent now. Not shocked anymore. Silent in that deeper way people become when they are watching someone reveal not one act but an entire character. Then came the most important moment. Karen took out her phone and made a call. The garage camera captured her voice clearly. "Yes, officer, I need to report that my tenant abandoned the unit," she said. "I'm concerned she may be unstable. She's been involved with a man who makes me feel unsafe." Ryan's face hardened. Natalie lifted her head slowly. Karen continued on the recording. "No, she is not locked out. She left voluntarily. I have secured the property because I'm afraid they may come back and cause damage." I paused the video. That was the lie in real time. Not later, not confused, not misremembered. Real time. While Natalie stood outside begging for her father's urn, Karen was inside calling law enforcement and creating the exact false narrative she later brought into my courtroom: abandonment, instability. Dangerous boyfriend, secured property. Every word had been chosen before the case was filed. I looked at Karen. She could barely meet my eyes. I said, "You called police while in possession of her belongings and told them she left voluntarily." Karen whispered, "I was scared." I said, "No, you were constructing a defense." That sentence landed hard because that was exactly what she had done. She had not merely reacted poorly. She had built a story. She had removed Natalie's property before Natalie came home. She changed the locks. She kept the urn. She damaged personal items. She told police Natalie was unstable. She accused Ryan of danger. She instructed Evan to hide evidence. And then she walked into court, pointed at the bench, and tried to intimidate the last room where Natalie might finally be believed. I asked Evan whether there were any more clips. His voice was quiet. "One more." Karen began shaking her head. "No. Please." That word again. Please, it came too late. The final clip began the next morning. The garage was brighter now. Sunlight came through a small side window. Karen entered carrying the small plastic bag with the ashes she had removed from the urn. She placed it inside the cardboard box with the other damaged items. Then she took out a marker. On the side of the box, she wrote one word, trash. Natalie stopped crying. That frightened me more than her sobbing. She just stared, still hollow. Ryan looked like he wanted to shield her from the screen, but he knew she had chosen to watch. So he stood there, helpless, in the way people become helpless when the pain cannot be blocked, only witnessed. The footage showed Karen lifting the box and carrying it toward the garage door. Then Evan entered the frame. He blocked her path. There was no audio at first, only movement. He pointed to the box. She tried to step around him. He grabbed the side of it. They struggled, not violently, but desperately. Finally, Evan pulled the box away from her. The audio returned halfway through. Evan said, "I'm not letting you throw away someone's father." Karen slapped him. The sound cracked through the courtroom. Evan lowered his head on the witness stand. Karen's body went still beside the bailiff. Natalie looked at Evan with tears in her eyes. For the first time, she saw that he had not simply brought evidence. He had paid for it. On the video, Karen shouted, "You are my son. You do what I say." Evan held the box behind him and said, "Not this." Those two words changed the room. Not this. That was the moment Evan stopped being part of Karen's control and became a witness against it. The footage ended. No one spoke. I let the silence remain because the silence belonged to Natalie. It belonged to Evan, too. And it belonged to every person in that courtroom who had just watched cruelty disguised as property management. Then Natalie spoke. Her voice was so quiet, I almost did not hear it. She made me beg for him. I looked at her. She was not looking at Karen. She was looking at the urn. She knew I didn't have anyone else. She knew he was all I had left. Karen cried out, "I was under stress." Natalie turned toward her then, and something in Natalie's face changed. For the first time in the entire hearing, she did not look afraid. She looked broken, yes, but not afraid. "You were under stress?" Natalie said, "I slept on my sister's couch thinking my father was locked in your garage because I didn't obey you." Karen sobbed, "I didn't mean for it to become this." Natalie answered, "You meant for me to hurt." That sentence silenced Karen completely because it was true, not legally precise, not polished. But true, Karen had meant for Natalie to hurt. The only thing she had not meant was to be caught. I asked the bailiff to secure the urn and the plastic bag with the respect appropriate to human remains. I ordered that the remaining belongings be cataloged, photographed, and returned under supervision. I also directed that the recordings, photographs, text messages, and testimony be preserved for possible criminal review. Karen looked up sharply. "Criminal?" I looked at her. "Yes, Miss Whitmore, criminal." Her face collapsed. She began crying openly now, shaking against the restraints, saying she had never been arrested before, saying she was a good landlord, saying she had only wanted to protect her home. But the courtroom no longer belonged to her version of events. It belonged to the evidence. I turned to Natalie and asked one final question before moving toward my ruling. "What do you want this court to understand?" Natalie held the broken plaque in one hand and looked down at her father's urn. Then she said, "I want the court to understand that she didn't just lock me out of an apartment. She tried to make me feel like I had no home, no rights, and no father." That was when I knew the final ruling had to be more than financial. It had to draw a line so clear that everyone in that courtroom would remember it. Because Karen Whitmore had entered pointing her finger at the court. But by the time the evidence was finished, every fact in the room was pointing back at her. I looked down at the evidence spread across the courtroom, and for a moment, I let myself take in the full weight of it: the lease, the messages, the recordings, the broken plaque, the opened urn, the photographs torn through the middle, the cardboard boxes that should have remained safely inside a young woman's apartment but had instead become proof of punishment. A courtroom is trained to organize chaos. That is part of the job. We take human conflict and place it into rules, claims, testimony, damages, orders. But sometimes the facts are so personal, so cruelly chosen, that even legal language feels too clean for what happened. Karen Whitmore had not simply violated a lease. She had invaded a life. Natalie stood at the plaintiff's table with Ryan beside her and Evan several feet away, still wiping his face. The urn had been placed carefully on the evidence table, treated now with the respect Karen had denied it. The broken plaque lay nearby, the words split but still readable, "A place of your own, but never alone." That sentence had been a father's blessing. Karen turned it into evidence. I looked at her. She was restrained, crying, no longer pointing, no longer commanding, no longer performing outrage as power. But I did not mistake collapse for remorse. That is one of the hardest lessons a judge learns. Tears do not always mean accountability. Sometimes tears are just the sound pride makes when it finally loses. I asked Karen one direct question. Did Natalie Brooks abandon the apartment? Karen stared at the table. Her lips trembled. No. The room went still. Did you change the locks before she returned from work? She nodded. I said, answer aloud. Yes. Did you remove her belongings before she came home? Yes. Did you keep her father's urn after she begged you to return it? Karen covered her face. Yes. Natalie closed her eyes. There are truths people know already, but hearing them admitted aloud still cuts. For weeks, Natalie had been forced to argue against a lie. In that moment, the lie finally stopped breathing. I asked, did you tell police she abandoned the apartment even though you knew she had not? Karen whispered, yes. Did you tell your son to hide or discard her belongings? Yes. Did you damage items that belonged to her? Karen hesitated. The bailiff shifted slightly. Karen looked at the broken plaque. Then she said yes. That final yes carried no nobility, no grace, no redemption. But it mattered because the record mattered. Natalie deserved more than suspicion. She deserved a clear truth stated where the lies had once been defended. I turned to Natalie. Her face was wet, but she was standing straighter now, not healed. No ruling can heal that kind of violation in one morning, but steadier. The court had finally become a place where Karen's voice was not the loudest thing in Natalie's life. I dismissed every claim Karen had made against Natalie completely. Then I ruled on Natalie's claim. I awarded the return of her security deposit, reimbursement for temporary housing, missed work-related losses supported by documentation, replacement costs for damaged property, and every allowable expense connected to the illegal lockout and withholding of her belongings. But I was not finished. I ordered Karen to return all remaining property immediately under supervision, not later. Not when she felt ready, not after she decided what Natalie deserved. Every box, every document, every photograph, every personal item, the court would not depend on Karen's honesty anymore. Officers would secure and inventory the remaining property. Then I addressed the urn. I ordered that the urn and the separated ashes be handled with dignity and returned to Natalie through proper supervision with documentation of their condition. I referred the matter for review of possible criminal violations connected to unlawful eviction, destruction of property, tampering with human remains, intimidation, and any other charge the authorities believed the evidence supported. Karen lifted her head. No, she said. Please, I can't be arrested over this. I looked at her for a long moment. Ems Whitmore, you were not arrested because of one bad moment. You were detained because you threatened this court, intimidated witnesses, ignored warnings, and showed a continued willingness to punish anyone who challenged you. She sobbed harder. I was scared. I said no. Natalie was scared. Evan was scared. Ryan was falsely accused. You were angry that you could not control them. That sentence settled over the room. Karen had no answer. For the first time all morning, silence did not feel like strategy. It felt like defeat. Then I turned to Evan. He could barely look at his mother. I told him, "Mr. Whitmore." Telling the truth today came at a cost. The court recognizes that. He nodded, but tears fell again. I do not pretend Evan was blameless. He helped move the boxes. He waited too long. He stayed quiet while Natalie suffered outside that apartment. But fear inside a controlling home can make cowards out of decent people. What matters is that when the moment came, he chose not to throw away a woman's father. That choice mattered. Natalie looked at Evan and said softly, "Thank you for bringing him back." Evan broke down. Karen turned her face away. That small exchange did more than punish Karen. It returned something human to the room. Not forgiveness, not exactly, but recognition. Evan had failed Natalie, then helped save what was left. Natalie, even wounded, understood the difference. Ryan stayed quiet until the ruling ended. He never once demanded attention. He never shouted back at Karen. He never became the monster she had described. And by the end of that hearing, everyone in that courtroom understood that Karen had not feared Ryan because he was dangerous. She feared him because he made Natalie less alone. That is what controlling people fear most. Witnesses' support. A second voice in the room, someone who says, "Record this." Someone who says, "You have rights." Someone who stands close enough for the victim to remember she is not trapped. Before Natalie left, I allowed her a moment with the urn. She placed both hands around it, carefully, as if apologizing through touch. She did not speak loudly, but I heard her whisper, "I'm sorry, Dad. That hurt to hear." Because she had nothing to apologize for. I said, "Mrs. Brooks." She looked up. "You did not fail him. You fought for him." Her face crumpled, but this time the tears were different. They were not the tears of a woman begging outside a locked door. They were the tears of someone finally being told the burden did not belong to her. Karen was escorted from the courtroom after the hearing. She did not point at me this time. She did not threaten the bench. She did not call Ryan dangerous or Natalie unstable. She walked out crying, wrists controlled, her red blazer wrinkled, her authority gone. And I remember thinking how quickly false power disappears when real accountability enters the room. People like Karen often believe ownership means control. They own the house, so they think they own the tenant's piece. They own the garage, so they think they own the boxes inside it. They own the lock, so they think they own the life behind the door. They are wrong. A lease does not erase dignity. A landlord does not become a ruler, and grief does not become leverage just because a cruel person finds the object that carries it. That case stayed with peace because Karen did not begin by hiding who she was. She told us immediately. She pointed at the court. She warned the bench. She believed fear would work because fear had worked before. But a courtroom, when it does its job, is where fear stops working. Natalie came in shaking, carrying an envelope and a grief Karen had tried to weaponize. She left with her father, her belongings secured, her name cleared, and a ruling that said clearly what Karen had tried to deny. She had rights, she had a home, she had a voice, and she had never abandoned any of it. So when people ask me why order matters in court, I think of that morning. I think of Karen's finger pointed at the bench. I think of Natalie flinching. I think of Evan walking in with a box he was told to destroy. I think of the video nobody was supposed to see. And I think of the moment Karen finally understood the truth. She had spent weeks making Natalie beg outside a locked door, but in my courtroom, the door opened for the evidence, and once it came in, Karen Whitmore could not sit down fast enough to escape it.